Hi, my name is Myra Sierra, and I'm the Community Partnerships Manager for Tipping Point. And I have the pleasure of talking to TJ Johnston, who is a member of our Community Advisory Board and the Associate Editor for the Coalition Street Sheet. TJ, do you want to say something? Say hello to folks?
Hello, everybody out there in Tipping Point land. Uh, um, as Myra said, I'm an assistant editor of the Street Sheet publication of the Coalition on Homelessness in San Francisco, and also contribute to other publications around. Um,
Great, thank you.
and and um, and also just involved with the Coalition on Homelessness human rights group and other work groups therein.
Great. And so the reason that we're talking to you today, TJ, is you wrote up a piece on um, folks accessing hotel rooms during this pandemic. But first, before we get into that, which is super interesting, and we really want to dig into kind of your process, want to ask you about how long have you been a journalist for? And that's kind of how I started to get to know you, is as a journalist. And so can you tell us a little bit about how you got into it and how long you've been doing it for?
Okay, well, I've been involved in journalism for almost 20 years, and it I pretty much fell into it by accident. Uh, a friend of mine whom I was working with invited me to take this free writing class over at Media Alliance in the city. And by writing, I kind of thought they were referring to fiction, poetry, short stories, things like that. Then I found out it was actually an investigative journalism class. And next thing I knew, I was working on this class project about nonprofits serving the homeless population. And I pretty much from there, I wound up working on other publications, and I've been heavily I have been writing for the Street Sheet off and on since then, a bit more consistently since 2007.
And can you tell us, you know, what is so unique about the street sheet, and then what exactly you do at the street sheet?
Okay, well, the Street Sheet is this twice a month newspaper that is published by the Coalition on Homelessness, and it focuses on news that are directly related to homelessness in specific and poverty in general. And what makes Street Sheet unusual is that most of the contributions to the paper, as far as journalistic or artistic content, comes mostly from people who are homeless themselves or who have been homeless. And and as a matter of fact, Street Sheet has is the oldest continuously publishing street paper in the United States. We've been operating since 1989, and yeah, and that's it's pretty much like a pioneer, in street journalism in this country.
And can you speak a little bit to the importance of, the inclusion of folks that are experiencing homelessness being journalists within the street sheet? Like, what does it add to it?
Okay, well, on any given topic, and this could be homelessness, it could be climate change, or anything else. The media tends to confer authority upon so-called experts who are usually they're usually the government officials, bureaucrats, or academics. uh, they're usually they're usually labeled as the experts, while people who are directly impacted or experiencing the effects of said social issue, like homelessness, they're merely referred to as advocates. So in a way, it's kind of like delegitimizing uh, their lived experience. Um, Whereas like over at Street Sheet, we tend to view people who are directly impacted, who are homeless themselves, who have lived on the streets, who have experienced the effects of of poverty. Um, we see them as the true experts.
Yeah, and I think that's super important. I know that oftentimes we use the terms people with lived expertise, and I think that's true. And I think it's fitting to call folks experts in their own experience. Now, I wanted to jump into the piece that you wrote, which I have up here. It's Unhoused, Sheltered in Place, Homelessness in Pandemic Times. Um, and wanted to ask a little bit about that process. Since we are sheltered in place during the pandemic, how how are you getting in touch with your sources? And a follow-up to that question is, what inspired you to write this piece, which is something that I think a lot of folks are talking about.
Okay. Well, I could start with the second question first. What inspired me to write this piece? Um, well, in short, it's just like the response to homelessness, like during this pandemic, or rather the lack of response or inadequate response, is something that I was struck by, and um, and again, it's
I think we lost the audio. Maybe can you hear us?
just like getting in contact with them. It's mostly like something that what a journalist would do, like um, for any other story. And in my case, it was just like putting the word out that on social media, online, and so forth, that I am that I'm looking to speak to people who are homeless, whether they're living on the streets or in encampments or in the shelters. Um, how are they dealing with this new climate that we're in? Um, and uh, and I focused like the story mostly on the placement of people in hotels. Um, have the city have the city uh, been able to respond in this way? Um, as uh, last month, the Board of Supervisors passed an emergency hotel ordinance that would fill more than 8,000 vacant hotel rooms with homeless people and with frontline service providers, so that they can actually self isolate and and protect themselves from the COVID virus, as well as if in case they did test positive, they would have a place where they could self quarantine and keep themselves safe and like you know um, and protect the people around them. It's much easier to do that within. I should probably back up saying in shelters and encampments, it's practically impossible to self-isolate. CDC recommends that you separate 6 feet away from the other person. If you're in like one of the larger shelters in San Francisco, you don't necessarily have 6 feet. You may maybe have 2 or 3 feet at most, and the virus just kind of like it pretty much like thrives under these conditions, whether it's like a homeless shelter, in nursing homes, jails, any kind of like mass congregate setting.
Yeah, and so you brought up the CDC guidelines, which, as you mentioned, are near impossible to do during these very congregate settings. How how do you, how should I say this? How do you want to see our city respond to the needs of unhoused people given the CDC guidelines?
Well, I mean, the best way that that advocates have been uh, proffering is to put people in hotel rooms, and it's not just homeless advocates, but it's also like medical and like public health officials who uh, have been extolling like the benefits of self quarantine, like within the hotel rooms. The UC Berkeley School of Public Health has pretty much said as much. Is the best way that you can keep people safe and healthy during this pandemic is like having what's called isolation housing, and within San Francisco, one of our most touristed cities in the country. Uh, the most expedient, immediate way we could do this is placing people in hotel rooms.
Yeah, can you tell me a little more about, the decision that folks are facing, whether they're in a shelter or a nav center or an encampment, like that decision, if they even have one, to move into a hotel, like what are people facing right now?
Okay, well, like in the middle of March, San Francisco issued its shelter-in-place order, and what it basically did is it kind of put a stop into the inflow and outflow of people like within the emergency shelter system. Um, People who have like an active 90-day shelter reservation basically had their reservations extended a bit as a result of this shelter in place order. Um, a lot of them, like most of the shelters are basically nighttime shelters. When the shelter in place order took effect, it pretty much made them 24-hour shelters. Um, it's possible for people to leave the shelter and return by a specific curfew time. As long as they make that curfew, um, they can come back in. And they also have the option of like staying like in the shelter for um, you know 24 hours a day, um, and just like this I guess the added check-in time and the added hours makes it easier for people who say have to like who are essential workers who have to uh, go to a job, so they could actually go there and return to the shelter and keep their reservation.
Yeah, I mean, that's a topic that has been spoken about a lot recently, of folks that are essential workers and them being much more vulnerable to COVID-19 because of that, being exposed and being out. I do want to ask you about your own experience and decision to leave the shelter. Do you want to talk about that?
Okay, well, yeah. Let's see. I was like staying at a shelter in San Francisco. Then I caught wind that somebody who works like for the organization operating in the shelter had tested positive like for the coronavirus, and I kind of like made it was pretty much a snap decision for me to exit the shelter, find some other place where um, I could go to without facing the risk of contracting the virus myself. Some friends of mine were able to put me up in a hotel. Um, then I did some couch surfing at the front of a friend's, and right now I'm staying at a place in Oakland right now. And so in a sense, my own sense of self-preservation pretty much drove me um, you know drove me to seek accommodations elsewhere. um, and it's you know and just and I'm hoping that I have made the right decision, and it seems so far I have. So
Yeah, it sounds like you had a lot of community support from your friends and your colleagues to help you get, into a hotel and even into the temporary situation that you're in right now, which I'm so happy that you're safe. And it's just, as people say, this is unprecedented times in which I think that your sentiment of self-preservation was right. I mean, you didn't feel safe, and hence you got yourself out of the situation, which is good. Um, it's I can imagine that folks who are unsheltered right now feel the same fear. Can I ask, when you were talking to your sources for the story, did you get what was the overlying sentiment? Are people scared? Like, how are people feeling right now?
uh, um, one person uh, one person who I spoke to um, eventually did get the virus, um, and his main concern was just not being informed by the shelter staff or being given enough information. um, how exactly how exactly the people staying in the shelters are going to be protected. um, like he moved he moved from the shelter to one hotel room in the Tenderloin, and then he tested positive and wound up moving into another hotel in South of Market. and and the thing that hit was that was irking him was nobody was necessarily telling him anything. He basically had to press the people around him, what exactly the hell is going on. um, and he has since moved back into the MSC South shelter, which is now being used as a sort of recovery center for unhoused people for when they tested positive for the coronavirus.
Um, Another question I had is, So people like who is qualified to get into a hotel, and how do they get access to get into a hotel? I think there's a lot of confusion about that.
Yeah, the city in San Francisco is they're focusing more on the people that they deem as vulnerables, which in this case are people who are 60 years of age or older, or have some kind of underlying health conditions. Um, in my case, I don't qualify in either category. Um, so uh, so I kind of wound up going outside of the system, just to self isolate. Um, and so far, that has been the city's you know um, method of operation, is to focus on those vulnerables. Um, Whereas, if you're unhoused, you're pretty much vulnerable, to any malady that comes its way. Um, and that's due to the lack of sanitation facilities, and just the proximity of people within these congregate settings. Um, and that's the challenge that people in the shelters are facing right now. There are also a couple of shelters in the city that are essentially under lockdown. Um, they kind of use the pandemic to establish and enforce these rules, saying that you could only go outside of the shelter if you are an essential worker, or if you have uh, some um, some valid reasons, um, such as going to a doctor's appointment, going to a place where you're an essential worker, and you have to report back by such and such a time. They kind of enforce these strict curfews, and if for some reason you aren't able to make it back by curfew time, you wind up being locked out. And you lose your reservation. And that's and that has happened at over at Next Door, which is on Pope and Geary. People have been reported been being kicked out um, for not coming back immediately after work, or soon enough after they go out for a cigarette break. And there's this whole other layer of of how does one uh, get back in the shelter, by appealing their denial of service. And um, and that's kind of added another layer of stress to people who are experiencing all these other stressors that are associated with homelessness. This is just one added crisis uh, on top of an ongoing crisis.
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned even in your own experience that you don't qualify, you're not deemed most vulnerable by the city. And I'm assuming there's a lot of folks who are in that limbo stage as well. But folks who do qualify, how do they get identified, and where do they go to access their hotel?
Let's see. Well, it's well, for one thing, the main access point is something called coordinated entry, where they go to the city's main system of delivering homeless services. They just and it's basically you know it's a large database. That's probably the best way I could put that, where you tell people, okay, well, I'm this old, I have if you have any chronic health conditions or disabilities, um, you volunteer that information, and all of which is the coordinated entry. What it is a sort of triage of like how people are able to get available housing for them, and I guess the city's main priority as far as the coordinated entry, pre COVID-19, has been people who have been on the street for 13 years or more, um, and then there are all these other groups that that fall below them. So um, and and so the city has been been following, I guess, that kind of paradigm, prioritizing people who are 60 or older, or people who have underlying health conditions, as to who gets placed in a hotel to self quarantine.
So, in your opinion, what can we do as a public, as a community, to protect more people?
To protect our unhoused residents, I mean, we just need to step up the game, and just and that's finding the available spaces, and it's not just like hotel room, but also vacant buildings. There was this group called Reclaim SF that occupied a vacant investment property in the Castro district in San Francisco, and they did this as a way of pointing out the urgency of the matter. Um, I mean, the San Francisco has maybe about 30,000 vacant housing units in general, and that's when you compare it with the number of unhoused people in San Francisco, it's around 10,000, maybe a bit more. Uh, that's a population that could be easily accommodated, uh, and just people who could be kind of kept safe during this crisis. And it's not just a question of capacity, as the city leaders have been touting throughout. It's a matter of political will. Um,
Do you think that the San Francisco resident has a role to play? And if so, what is that role in terms of making sure that more people who are unsheltered, unhoused, experiencing homelessness, that we keep them safe? What can the public do?
okay, well, the public has been voicing its concerns through the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, and also in the actions, just Reclaim SF's action this past Friday, and also the Do No Harm Coalition, and also Faith in Action. The previous night, held a vigil outside of Mayor London Breed's place, saying put our unhoused neighbors in a place where they could be safe, and just, yeah. So there's that pressing of public officials that people like you and I would be able to do. Um, Also, if there are other I guess there are other organizations or other groups, other mutual aid groups. If you could, if
I think the audio cut off a little bit. Do you mind repeating the last thing one more time?
Sorry?
I think the audio cut off a little bit on your last.
Oh, okay.
Do you mind repeating it?
Oh, okay. Well, there's like contacting your public officials. That's a way of like impressing them to like step up their game. Uh, Also, as something that's more, I guess, immediate is like find out where there are kind of like these mutual aid groups where one could like provide direct relief to unhoused people, and that could be like as something as simple as like handing out hand sanitizers or personal protective equipment. Um, that's something that you know that John or Jane Q Publica would be able to do in their capacity.
Yeah, I think especially around the PPE, it's super important. I know that a lot of folks on our advisory board have been passing out masks and sanitizers into encampments and all over the Tenderloin, which are very much needed. So I have just two more questions. And, that's where, so as this story unfolds, what should we be looking out for? What will you focus on next?
Let's say, well, just like keeping abreast of like you know, of the city's response. Just like Mayor Breed usually holds a special press conference around 1 o'clock weekdays. Um, and there are like just like plenty of like organizations like the Coalition on Homelessness that they are like involved in several efforts. Um, you know, so like there's that, and just like it, and just any like community-based organizations, they could inquire like within, saying, okay, what can someone like me or what our neighbors could do can do to like make this um you know make make life under COVID-19 that more bearable, uh you know you know under like these circumstances.
Yeah. Do you envision you expanding on your story later or as kind of things progress?
Yeah, well, it kind of depends. It's like just like just as far as like following up on my sources. um I definitely would like to do like a continuation uh of this story. And it's, I kind of have like a little more breathing room than I did last month. uh so it's like just like it was like a matter of like okay, I gotta check these like messages on my phone or my computer. It's like maybe they're coming back to me. And so uh
I mean,
but,
if I know you,
I'm also, well, just as an added point, like I'm if you do like have anybody who does have a lead, they could like find me on social media, like on Twitter at TJ Johnston 415, or like the Coalition on Homelessness, so or Street Sheet. So
great. I know as I've gotten to know you, I know that you're super busy and that you're involved in all the things. And so I just want to say thank you on behalf of myself and Tipping Point and the Community Advisory Board. I know that you do so much work. And so thank you for your really important journalism that you do to make sure that the voices of people experiencing homelessness are always, at the top and heard and elevated. So thank you, TJ.